Hello, everyone. As you can tell by the title of this video I'm about to watch with you guys, this is going to be GameSpot's take on Kingdom Hearts versus Final Fantasy. This is a part of their Versus series, which evidently I guess isn't around any longer, and I think I kind of get why. I'm just going to go ahead and put out a disclaimer. I know we like to dunk on gaming journalists and we like to make fun of their abilities to play games, but I think having an opinion about a game is perfectly fine. And I think that having, a unique opinion, that's cool, but there's a little bit of bashing that goes on in here, and it's not really due to this lovely lady that's on screen right now. I'm not trying to sound like a creep or anything, but she's really nice about everything that happens in this, and the other guy's just kind of weird, kind of like one of those anime gatekeepers, those incels that we've been talking about lately on Twitter. So anyway, without further ado, shall we get into it?
What is the lamest moment from your game series? I'm not being funny, but I love Axel. But when he introduced himself in Kingdom Hearts 2, he's like, the name's Axel.
Got it memorized.
This is Versus, the GameSpot show that pits your favorite.
I'm actually really inclined to agree with her on that. That, looking back at it, when I was a kid, that was pretty, I was like, but now it's like, that is really lame. Doesn't really, I don't know if it's bad translation or what, but it is really lame.
Games, consoles, franchises, and hot button issues against each other. This week we've got a Square Enix civil war as we pit Kingdom Hearts against Final Fantasy. Fighting for Kingdom Hearts is Lucy James, who actually choked up on multiple occasions during the filming of this video due to the sheer nostalgia of it all.
Legacy!
And arguing the case for Final Fantasy is Tamoor Hussain, who imported the Japanese.
I do not like this guy one bit. Like, I've seen him, he previewed Devil May Cry 5 before it came out, and he did an absolutely horrendous job. And he was so proud of himself because he got an S score, an S rank, but the build that he was given was made so people could get an S rank easily to make them feel good about the game. This is like hardcore facts, by the way. So yeah, it was pretty hard to not get an S rank on that, but he got an S rank and he was really proud of it. I'm just here to dunk on him a bit for that, but we'll see what he says in this video.
Version of Final Fantasy IX, and then started learning Japanese just so he could figure out what was going on. Each are going to argue the corner for their game over the course of 3 rounds, with the overall winner being decided by you, the wonderful viewers. Last week's debate to figure out the best Batman Arkham game saw Lucy win with 55% of the vote for her Arkham City argument. But to vote for who you think argued their case better in this episode, we're going to be throwing up a clickable poll right here on YouTube. Right, let's get into the debate.
Another thing, I don't care what the polls say. I kind of want to dismiss this. As a whole, I guess I would say I like Kingdom Hearts games more than Final Fantasy altogether, because I've only really owned Final Fantasy 7, 13, and 15. And I like 13-1, despite what people might say about it. I think it's a perfectly fine game. I love Final Fantasy 7. I have owned 8, but I haven't beat it yet. And Final Fantasy 15 is atrocious. I haven't played 14 yet, though I hear it's pretty good. But that's my history of Final Fantasy. Now, Kingdom Hearts, I played Kingdom Hearts 1, 2, 3, Birth by Sleep. Basically everything that you could play in Kingdom Hearts 1.5, 2.5, 2.8, and 3 collections. So, yeah. So, without further ado, let's get this started.
Hello, Tamoor.
Hello.
I see you've come as a member of Final Fantasy 15's boy band.
First of all, what is this personal attack on my...
That was actually a sick burn. That harkens back to the point, or not to the point, to the fact that everybody in Final Fantasy 15 has like no swag whatsoever. They wear all black. They're all edgy boys, even without having edgy personalities. They all seem to like wear the same color, and I think it has something to do with the kingdom that they come from. But when you're playing a video game and all the characters are wearing the same shit, it doesn't really add a lot of diversity. Like you might actually forget who is who because of that. You know, you ever play a game and somebody asks which character is your favorite, and you only remember the color that they're wearing, and now you gotta be like, I like the guy who's wearing black, or I like the guy whose hair was black. You mean Noctis? Some people think his hair is black when it's like bluish, right? No, the blonde. Oh, you mean Ignis, because some people might mistake Ignis for being like a dirty blonde or something. You know what I mean? Anyway, let's go.
Appearance. Classic Kingdom Hearts fan, just going for the appearance. Secondly, I was up all night reading about Final Fantasy, and this is what you look like after you do that, Lucy.
Let's begin. Story/characters.
Let's go. The floor is yours, Lucy. Tell us about Kingdom Hearts' story. Tell us in detail about Kingdom Hearts' story. Please make it make sense, because I've played every single one of those games and I don't know what's going on.
It all started.
I really hate that meme. You know, if you play Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 consecutively without playing Chain of Memories, you can figure out what's going on. I had Chain of Memories and I never beat it because fuck that card system, but you know, I figured out what happened because of notes from, I think it was Jiminy's journal from Kingdom Hearts 2, and I put the pieces together. And if you play Kingdom Hearts 1, things are pretty much explained to you throughout the game. They leave room for mystery at the end of each game. I think they got worse and worse about that the more games went on. Like, Birth by Sleep left a lot of unanswered questions, and so did Dream Drop Distance, and Kingdom Hearts 3 like barely answered any of that. So yeah, but overall, if you play those games consecutively, you pretty much know what's going on. So I don't know what this guy is talking about. He doesn't understand what's going on. Like, how dumb could you be? It's not hard. It's only hard when you get past Kingdom Hearts 2, and past Kingdom Hearts 2 is only like 25% of the series. Well, you know what? Let's not say 25%. Let's say like 30. So you should be able to understand most of the series up until that point. You know, I'm talking timeline-wise. Because when you get to Dream Drop Distance, it gets confusing. And then there's the Book of Key or whatever. I don't know what the hell happened there. They don't explain that very well. But you should know.
And a long time ago, Keyblade was... Anyway, no. So... Kingdom Hearts' story, I'm going to begin by acknowledging the faults in that it is, yes, very convoluted, but ultimately at the core of it, when you're playing Kingdom Hearts, that doesn't really matter because you can get through the game without really understanding the intricacies of everything. The thing about Kingdom Hearts is...
I actually will agree with her on that. That's totally possible. I dare you to get through Final Fantasy VII and tell me that it's easy to get through that without knowing what's going on at all times. I want you to get through Wall Market without telling me what's going on.
Introducing the characters as well is that they did such a smart thing by not only creating new characters like Sora, Naminé, Kairi, whatever, but they also integrated it with these two franchises, well, multiple franchises that people know and love, Final Fantasy and Disney, and that means that they create this story and feature characters that everyone already has an emotional bond with because you've basically grown up with these characters. And so that's why overall the main story of Kingdom Hearts is like, it's a backdrop because that's not really why you're there. You're there because you want to recreate childhood by playing around with these characters in these worlds that you know so well. Part of...
A little backstory on me. I didn't beat Final Fantasy VII by the time Kingdom Hearts came out. And when I played Kingdom Hearts, I barely recognized Cloud. I only recognized the Disney villains and the Disney heroes. I didn't really beat Final Fantasy VII until around like 2005-ish, something like that. Because when Final Fantasy VII came out, I was very young. And it was before I was even in kindergarten, if I remember correctly. And I got it on my birthday thinking it was 8 because I had the demo for 8. And I think I asked for 7. It was something confusing. Like, I think my cousin thought that Final Fantasy 8 was actually 7. And I asked my parents for 7 and then they got me 7. And yeah, I couldn't read. So I didn't get very far in. I got past Wall Market, like I said before, but I still didn't understand what was going on. But when I was in my teens and I could read and take things in and understand, I gained an appreciation for it unlike ever before. But yeah, I'll let her continue.
Kingdom Hearts' appeal is it's because it's our generation who played it, and you think about the age we were when we played Kingdom Hearts. You play games and you'd be like, I don't care what I'm doing, but all I know is I've got Donald and Goofy by my side, and I'm whacking the crap out of some Heartless, and I'm saving the Princesses of Heart and whatever, and I don't know, I'm just working my way to that final world.
See, story is at the heart of Final Fantasy. It's always been a story-driven series, and because of that, its characters are also incredibly important to the entire franchise. It's like everyone comes to Final Fantasy for the story, and whether you like it or not, every story presents something different and interesting. It's different thematically. It's always trying to tackle some different element of a narrative. Like, for example, 15 is all about like the road trip, the friendship, the coming of age story. Lads on tour. You know, 7's all about.
I would argue that that's a meme and that's not entirely true. Like, Final Fantasy 15 was so much more than guys just traveling around having a good time. Like, it was very disjointed and there was a war going on, but it didn't focus on that enough. And that is why I don't like Final Fantasy 15. You need separate forms of media to understand that entire game. And, you know what, I'm not going to let it become the focus of what my point is. My point is, not every Final Fantasy, like you said, you can like it or not, and not everybody's going to like every story, which is why I had to give a story to Kingdom Hearts, because it's kept people invested over a series of over 11 years. You know, like Kingdom Hearts 2 came out in 2006 of February, I believe, for the US. Kingdom Hearts 3 didn't come out until 2017 in February, or was it March, or was it January? And people were still invested in that story for over 11 years. I have never... Well, Final Fantasy VII is an exception, but it's a monster in Final Fantasy. It's a mutant, you know? I don't think I would ever be invested in any other series as much because there's not a compilation. Like Final Fantasy 13-1, I like 13-1, but because they got rid of the characters from 13-1, and you couldn't play with them in 13-2 or 3, I couldn't find myself, you know, invested with that. So, yeah, in Final Fantasy 15, I can't be invested with that either because it's so disjointed. So, what I'm trying to say is, I'm giving it to Kingdom Hearts, and him trying to take away the point from her that, oh, the story's convoluted. The story is convoluted, but, you know, the story is convoluted in Final Fantasy. If you look at Final Fantasy VII compilation, you know what I mean.
You know, eco-terrorism and
12 is Star Wars.
12 is Star Wars, and it's a great take on Star Wars. Very few franchises out there can take kind of like the framework of Star Wars and the blueprint of Star Wars and spin it in a way that's interesting and good, and that's one of the ones that kind of really sticks out. I don't think that game gets enough love for doing that. No. Every single one always has a clear, defined kind of like narrative thread through it. It might be ridiculous at the time, you might not like it, but it's always clear and understandable, and the characters along the way, I mean...
As I mentioned before, Final Fantasy 15 is not clear and understandable. From the point that you turn that game on, you don't know what is happening, and you have 4 people with you whom you don't know what the motive is for them being with you. Until you play the game a little bit further, if you didn't research Final Fantasy 15 beforehand, you will not know what is happening. And that is something that I will say about 15. 13, people say story is convoluted. I think 13.1 story is easy, but 13.1, 13.2, and 13.3, I don't know what 13.2 is about, per se. I guess Lightning's supposed to be dead. And 13.3, she's like a god or something. Makes no sense with the continuity of 13.1, if you ask me. But I haven't played 13.2 or 3. So, I'm confused, right? I'm confused. I should know what's going to happen and what the world is like thanks to world building from Final Fantasy, but I don't know what 13, 2, and 3 could be like. You know, and that's on me, but I think that takes away from his point. Anyway, let's go.
Final Fantasy is responsible for some of gaming's most iconic characters. Characters like Sephiroth, for example. You can take Sephiroth. I'm not even trying this. Cloud, you know, my favorites like Zell in 8 and Squall in 8, and also.
I'm not going to dunk on him for liking Zell, because I like Zell as well, from Final Fantasy VIII. And Squall, I don't really have the negative perception on Squall like a lot of other people do, because I haven't really played through the entire game of 8. I'm not going to dunk on him, but to say that they're some of the most iconic. Cloud and Sephiroth, I'll give you those. Like, you got to have Cloud and Sephiroth mentioned most of the time, you know, when you're talking about Final Fantasy. You might mention Squall, but I've never heard anybody really mention Zell like that. Like, Zell doesn't even sound like a real character that somebody made. You know what I mean? It sounds like something that, like, a younger child might have made. Zell, yeah, that's Zell. You know what I mean? Anyway.
The enemies as well. Like, I don't want to rag on Kingdom Hearts because I love Kingdom Hearts, but like, the enemies in that, the Heartless, are kind of just like.
Yeah, but it's not really the
blobs.
Heartless, because you have the Organization 13, but you also have the regular Disney villains, and like I think that to Kingdom Hearts' strength is they use characters like Hades and Maleficent to greater effect, because they are basically ringleaders amongst the other Disney villains.
But the vast majority of times, you're not fighting them. You're fighting the squishy black things, and then that's the that's the kind of like end goal. Whereas Final Fantasy, it's got all these iconic characters. I mean, you've got a Final Fantasy character on your mug.
I feel like he got ridiculously defensive right there. So the problem with what he said was he tried to really condense it to, or what's the word I'm looking for here? He tried to condense. Let's just use condense. He tried to condense the enemies in Kingdom Hearts into, like, you know, nothings. You know, coincidentally, there are enemies called nobodies in Kingdom Hearts, but he tried to condense them down to nothing. These little black blobs. That's not all what Kingdom Hearts is about. As a matter of fact, in Kingdom Hearts 1, there are, and 2, and most of the series really, there are some Heartless that are made in the shape of the darkness from the heart of the Disney villains. For instance, like Scar, the ghost of Scar, he had a Heartless, and it was gigantic, you know. And it's not like it was lacking personality. Scar was in the fight, and he was fighting as well, but you know, he's just saying it's just blobs. It's not just blobs. You fight the Disney villains. You fight the original characters that are made for Kingdom Hearts, like Xemnas, Ansem, and, you know, more Ansem because he's like the main antagonist, and other characters like Xigbar, yada yada yada. I would name more. It's just that I'm just giving a few examples. Axel, of course, Roxas, etc. And there's even Final Fantasy characters that you can fight. So to say to, you know, condense it down to, oh, you just fight black blobs, it's a little disingenuous, don't you think?
Yeah, we don't really have anything lying around the office. This is the
So
only
like
thing we
Mughals,
have.
I mean, it's not an enemy. Mughals, like
It's a shop.
Behemoth, every aspect of Final Fantasy is heavy on characterization.
Yeah, but in my game, you can summon Chicken Little.
In my game, you can summon Knights of the Round.
He's so proud of himself. Knights of the Round. Most people probably don't know what that is. I don't know if it's in most Final Fantasy games. I know it's in 7. That's cool, but, you know, because it's Knights of the Round doesn't mean that you can just, you know, deflect what she's talking about. Like, Chicken Little is an alright summon, but there are better summons. Like Simba in Kingdom Hearts 1 is pretty good. I'm not really a summon guy, but I really like Simba in Kingdom Hearts 1. And Kingdom Hearts 2, I think Genie was really cool because Genie would change with your drive forms. Oh, Genie would have his own drive forms, I'm sorry. Yeah, Genie was really strong. So yeah, Knights of the Round is cool. Don't get me wrong, but it's really weird that he was really like, I hate when people do that shit.
Next topic is gameplay.
Take it away.
Every Final Fantasy game is unique in... It's unique, but it also shares a lineage between it. There's always like familiar gameplay touch points, like upgrading and that kind of stuff. But each game will provide you something unique to the way you interface with the game. So like 7's known for its materia systems, 8 is known for its flawed but interesting draw system, which I was a big fan of. The gameplay for Final Fantasy, since its beginning, has also defined the way RPGs are played in a lot of ways, to the point where people yearn to play those types of games. We've just had a new release.
I believe Final Fantasy helped popularize this type of gameplay, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Shin Megami Tensei games predate Final Fantasy games, and Final Fantasy games are inspired by Shin Megami Tensei games. Let's see. Hey Google, when was the first Shin Megami Tensei game made? September 11th, 1987. Interesting. Digital Devil Story. Hey Google, when was the first Final Fantasy game made? December 18th, 1987. Huh. Alright.
Octopath Traveler. And the whole shtick, one of the main kind of like selling points of that is it's a classic RPG experience. And it's classic because it leans heavily on Final Fantasy. Within each Final Fantasy game, it's not just an RPG type experience where you're fighting battles. Everyone provides something unique to do as well. Like 7 had a bit where you were like riding a bike, a motorbike. 8 has the cards.
There's a lot of 7 footage in this.
Basically playing a competitive card game. Most people who create RPGs at some point or another will look at a Final Fantasy game and be like, take inspiration from it. So when it comes to RPGs, there's not really any other franchise that can prove to, or can say that it has gameplay as strong as Final Fantasy.
The gameplay of Kingdom Hearts is, like, people will oversimplify and say it's just button mashing and just like hitting X over and over again, occasionally hitting triangle, and that it can be dulled, it can be dumbed down to that. But ultimately, at the same time, it is an RPG. You get upgrade points, you get to unlock new abilities. And the thing that I love about Kingdom Hearts is that it's so mobile and you are constantly on the move. If you're doing things properly, you are like executing these rad combos, you're using your party members, you're moving all around. And I think to Kingdom Hearts credit is the fact that you have all these different worlds, and like I can talk at length about how great it is to be in the worlds, but the way that the worlds influence the gameplay, so you can swap out your party members who each have their own abilities. You have like location specific, like those limit moves, like the awesome huge ones, like depending on your party members, which kind of just mixes things up a bit. Also, you whack people around the face, you have magic, you hit people with a giant key, and you have different drive forms. And then you get 2 keyblades, and you are just smacking people with 2 keys, and it's rad.
Here it comes.
Taken from Final Fantasy.
I know.
Every single element of that is Final Fantasy.
Well, pretty much, but it's like the more, like, now Final Fantasy combat is basically becoming Kingdom Hearts. Now with 15, it's way more like Kingdom Hearts.
Okay, so I just want to step on his point really quickly because I feel like he, like, tried to interrupt her a bit. And I just want to step on the point that he's trying to make. So he says that all the elements come from Final Fantasy. That is not true, because to my knowledge, Final Fantasy was always an RPG, and a turn-based RPG at that. So when Kingdom Hearts came out, I don't think it took that many cues from Final Fantasy. It may have took some movements. Maybe it took some elements like the name of magic, like Fire, Firaga. I'm with you there. But it definitely did its own thing. And it was like one of the first really popular action RPGs where you were really mobile and actually able to do quite a few things. I think Kingdom Hearts doesn't get its flowers enough for that. You know, people love to talk about how its story is, and people love to talk about is Disney and Final Fantasy. Can we talk about the combat system being like one of the best combat systems ever made for a video game? And this is somebody who doesn't like Kingdom Hearts 3. I'm honestly shocked that people don't talk about that more. Final Fantasy 15 could not stand in Kingdom Hearts 2's shadow. You know what I mean? Or 1 for that matter. Final Fantasy 15's combat was really boring. It could be dumbed down to just hold this button and attack and switch weapons with whatever enemy is weak against this weapon. Which, by the way, it burns me that each enemy has like a different resistance to a different type of weapon. Makes no sense. And it makes no sense how if you do a massive big fire spell and there's fire on the ground, it burns you. You could burn yourself with your own spell. Awful. And, you know, Square Enix made Kingdom Hearts and they made Final Fantasy 15. So how is Kingdom Hearts so much better than 15? It makes no sense to me. You know, they didn't see both of their games and were like, oh, well, this one's different from this one and that's what we want. But, God, you can burn yourself. The weapon weaknesses, like the attacks don't feel like they have any weight behind them. Jeez. All that comes from Final Fantasy. Shut the fuck up, dude.
It feels a lot more like Kingdom Hearts, but the DNA of both games is strongly still Final Fantasy, though.
Yeah, no, completely.
But
No, it's not.
Finally coming together, bringing the audiences together, and
Yeah.
hopefully they kind of benefit from each other. 15 certainly, combat certainly benefited from being a little more like Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah, both the DNA is super Final Fantasy, but I think in some regards I prefer the more action.
What you just seen was, I think it was pre-release footage of Noctis going into his special mode where he has all of his weapons available for him to use. And basically what happens is he teleports a bunch in the air while... You can hold circle to do it. It's not that exciting. And he just has a different weapon come out and he attacks with a different weapon each time. It's not that cool.
Like Havoc in Kingdom Hearts.
Very conveniently left out the gummy ship there, didn't we?
What is wrong with the gummy ship? Like, I get it, you don't want to travel via gummy ship. You can warp to each stage. You don't have to use a gummy ship in every Kingdom Hearts. And, yeah, customizing gummy ships can be addicting. So, what the fuck is he talking about? You conveniently left out the gummy ships. That motherfucker, there was a card game in Final Fantasy VIII. Shut up.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Legacy.
Let's go.
So I think Kingdom Hearts, like, remember when Marvel were like, Avengers Infinity War is the most ambitious crossover event in movie history? Kingdom Hearts is certainly probably one of the most ambitious crossover events. Literally, the story about how Kingdom Hearts happened is that Nomura-san was playing Super Mario Sunshine, and he was like, oh, I'm really inspired by this movement. I'd love to make a game of this. We haven't really got a character who's as famous as Mario, but Mickey Mouse would be good. And then it turns out Disney and Square Enix were in the same building. A Disney exec and a Square exec were in the same.
Couldn't have been Super Mario Sunshine. They came out in 2003, and Kingdom Hearts came out in 2001. I think maybe 2000 in Japan. But what she's about to say, let me just say I'm on her side again about this. I am going to be probably throughout the entire video. I don't like the way she went about it, but I agree with her. Because when it comes to Legacy, well, we'll talk about it.
Lift.
They kissed.
And they pitched the idea, and it was a literal elevator pitch. That is a crossover event that, like, one in however many million things that would happen, let alone for the games to actually exist. And for it all to kind of just work together so well and to explore these Disney properties in a new way with a new overarching storyline that's not the same thing that we've seen over and over again in Disney movies, and for a new spin on it, I kind of like that. And the thing is, it's like, by the time 3 comes out, it'll have been 13 years, and the fact that the fans are so passionate about it, like, that can't be, like, people are still so incredibly passionate about games. Legacy of Kingdom Hearts is... The legacy of Kingdom Hearts is they made games that were so good and so special to so many people that these people haven't been able to let go of that and are still so passionate about it years and years later. And we both are, like,
Yeah.
and it's a kind of very special thing that they managed to do.
I agree with all that, and it's very much echoed by Final Fantasy. Like, the legacy of Final Fantasy is the legacy of RPG gaming. Like, it's helped, like I said before, it's helped define RPGs. It helped bring people to RPGs that may not have before. It's defined console generations. Square Enix going to PlayStation, for example, from Nintendo. That was a huge deal. And it was business considerations that ultimately made that happen with the CD versus the cartridge. But still, that was massive, and, like, in a lot of ways, Final Fantasy is what pushed PlayStation to success.
There's a lot of ways to interpret what he just said. So the first way is to think that he thinks that Final Fantasy is solely responsible for the success of PlayStation, which I disagree with. And then there's the other interpretation that's a little bit more mild and understanding, like it helped push PlayStation, you know. And indeed it did. It did help PlayStation, but we also had Crash, Tomb Raider to a certain extent. I think Gex helped with that, even though it was on PC. There was a lot of mascots back in the day. Spyro. There was a couple of Resident Evil. Like, there was a lot of games back in the day. I can't even name them all. Tomba is another one that comes to mind that were on PlayStation. Ape Escape. I just keep naming them. I'm thinking about all the old games I used to love. All these games are pretty popular. Twisted Metal. There's a lot of games that made PlayStation. And he is right, to his credit. I think that Final Fantasy really did shape a lot of RPG elements today, but also you got to give credit to the king. Shin Megami Tensei had this type of gameplay since September of 1987, and they've had this since December. Now, is it right to just say, oh, they stole the gameplay? I wouldn't say they stole the gameplay, but they were definitely inspired. So we got to give Shin Megami Tensei their flowers. You know what I mean? Or Shin Megami Tensei, Sega. We got to give Sega, Atlas, we got to give them their flowers. So what she was saying about Kingdom Hearts, excuse me, sorry. I don't want to be like DSP, but what she was saying about Kingdom Hearts was the legacy between the crossover. And to a certain extent, I agree, but we also got to remember that Kingdom Hearts is not just a crossover. It is its own game. And it's been a game that people have been waiting on their, the tip of their toenails on, or on pins and needles. People have been waiting on pins and needles for like the next game for over 11 years. And the fact that we are still waiting for the next game, the next title, to come from the Kingdom Hearts family says something. It says a lot to me. There's a lot of people I knew who did not care if Final Fantasy 16 ever came out, right? Final Fantasy 16 was like the back of their mind. They're like, oh, we want 7. Which is very telling about, people who play Final Fantasy. Like, obviously they love their older games. They're nostalgic about them. And 14 is an addictive MMO. I don't think people really too much cared that 16 was going to arrive or not. But everybody was already anticipating Kingdom Hearts, the next entry. Especially after the secret ending of Kingdom Hearts 3 and the DLC. People are really excited about KH. People still are excited about Final Fantasy, but I think the legacy of Kingdom Hearts sort of outweighs Final Fantasy because it includes Final Fantasy and it includes Disney. So that's all I got to say about that.
Each of those games, the legacy is like far-reaching, and like you said, music. Like,
Yep.
Yoko Shimomura has done amazing work in all of Square Enix's games. Like, similarly, Uematsu-san, he's created some of the most iconic, memorable video game music, whether it's, the Prelude theme from Final Fantasy, the series, or like One Winged Angel. Again, like, I don't mean this in a way to be like, oh, Kingdom Hearts. There's a reason why Kingdom Hearts until this point has relied so heavily on Final Fantasy for its kind of like star characters. There's a reason why when
I wouldn't say it relied heavily on Final Fantasy characters for its star characters. In Kingdom Hearts 1, you speak to Yuffie, Aerith, and you speak to Squall about 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times in total, possibly 5. And you speak to Cloud like once or twice. In Kingdom Hearts 2, not so much. Well, actually, no. They speak a couple of times, but mostly the conflict and the story is in between the original Kingdom Hearts characters and Disney characters, like Maleficent and Pete. As a matter of fact, if you look, it sort of like lessens the impact of Final Fantasy characters as the series goes on. Because if you play Final Fantasy, Birth by Sleep, the only Final Fantasy character I remember from that game was Zack. And Zack is only in for a bit. He's in everybody's scenario, but he's only in one stage, and they keep going on. The game is still really good. So I think that's kind of fucked up that he's like, oh, well, they rely on the Final Fantasy characters. Well, if it's a crossover, what difference does it fucking make? You know, it's not like Cloud is on the front lines actually pushing the story forward. He's a guy in the background who helps fight. And that's what Final Fantasy characters are boiled down to in Kingdom Hearts. Look at Tifa in Kingdom Hearts 2. Do you remember what Tifa did in Kingdom Hearts 2? Nothing. She was looking for Cloud. She fought like one guy, and she was looking for Cloud most of the time.
We were in an interview with Nomura-san, we said where the Final Fantasy characters are, and he said, man, people really want Final Fantasy characters.
Is that not a way, though, that you think that
People really want Final Fantasy characters because it's a crossover. I don't even understand why he tried to use that as a point. That'd be like if I played Marvel vs. Capcom, the fighting game, and I was like, man, I really wonder where Wolverine, Storm, Magneto, and Sentinel are, because they weren't in MVCI. It's like, well, it's Marvel vs. Capcom, and they've been in every Marvel vs. Capcom. Where the fuck are they? They're supposed to be in this game.
Kingdom Hearts is maybe moving away from Final Fantasy now?
Yeah,
because
it is.
Because it feels like it's big enough.
It is, and I'm glad it's doing that now. I'm glad it's not relying on that, but I'm also kind of sad that they're not in there. Those appearances were some of my favorite moments, but like the legacy of Final Fantasy is like indisputable. It's far-reaching, it's critical to gaming's history, and it probably will be to its future for a little while longer.
Yeah.
Let us know who you think won the debate by voting in our poll at the top right corner of the video, or if you're over on GameSpot.com by putting your thoughts in the comments section below. It'll be your votes that decide.
Okay, so that's the end of the video, and I gotta say, I think she won. I think her side wins. I don't know if she made a good enough case on everything. It seemed like she was kind of like, you know, just accepting of what that guy was saying. And, you know, he was like kind of really aggressive. And it's, you know, I want to say it's okay to be passionate about games that you love, games that you like, especially franchises that you love that have been around for a while. It's okay to be passionate about it, but don't be a fucking dick. He was kind of a dick in some of these, and I don't understand why you would treat anybody that way, let alone like a woman. You know, there's just, she loves Kingdom Hearts. She took Kingdom Hearts' side, and you're just over here like, oh, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. But basically, this is his demeanor. That doesn't mean anything because Final Fantasy came first, and you need Final Fantasy to survive. It's obviously not true if we look at Kingdom Hearts 3 and its sales, and honestly, I just think that he lost because he's tripping off nostalgia, and he's really wanting to, he's really trying to get the audience to be on his side about it by saying things like, oh, well, a lot of the things in Kingdom Hearts were, you gotta thank Final Fantasy for that. Like, no, you don't. You don't have to thank Final Fantasy for Kingdom Hearts elements. They would have been there regardless, you know? If it had every Final Fantasy character in it, none of them play like Sora, none of them are partners like Goofy and Donald, and without Kingdom Hearts, I don't think anybody would have a good idea of how Cloud would fight in an action environment. If you're like, think about Kingdom Hearts 1 and Kingdom Hearts 2 and Cloud and how he fights in both of those games. It's way different than what he would do in Final Fantasy 7, no? Well, you have Kingdom Hearts to thank for that, if you want to be that way. But I think I'm done with this video. I'm going to post it up at some point today. Well, today being March 3rd, so yeah. If you like this video, let me know what you want me to do next.
Decide who wins, so make
Why did I do that?